Most people think wars change the world with bombs. They do. But that is not the deepest way they change it. The deepest changes usually happen in the balance sheet, in the pipes, in the currency system, in the quiet legal rewiring that arrives after the fear has done its work. That is why I never watch a geopolitical crisis only for the headlines. I watch it for the financial motive underneath, and if you ask me what I think is really happening now, I would put it to you this way. The war is the trigger, the debt is the motive, the wallet is the end point. That is the mother line of this whole story. Because if you understand that one line, the rest of the pieces begin to stop looking random. Oil is not just oil. The Strait of Hormuz is not just geography. The dollar is not just a currency. Treasuries are not just bonds. Stablecoins are not just tech. Universal basic income is not just social policy. Artificial intelligence is not just automation. These things are all starting to lock together into one larger structure. And that structure, if it fully forms, could become the most powerful financial control system of our lifetime. I do not say that for drama. I say it because I have spent too much of my life around capital not to notice when a crisis begins doing double duty. A crisis can be real and useful at the same time. Real in its damage. Useful to the people closest to power. That is one of the oldest patterns in history. Every major disruption creates two tracks. One track is the public pain. The other track is the institutional opportunity. Most people only feel the first one. The second one is where systems get redesigned. That is what I want you to see. Not the smoke, the redesign happening behind the smoke. Let us begin where the pressure begins. Most people still do not understand how fragile modern prosperity really is. They think of energy as one category on a news ticker. Oil up, oil down, gas prices annoying, airlines hurt, fine. That is kindergarten economics. The adult version is harsher. Energy is buried inside almost everything you think of as ordinary food shipping, plastics, chemicals, fertilizer, trucking, heat, cooling, industrial production, airline tickets, manufacturing, logistics, military transport, packaging. Every layer of physical civilization has energy running through it like blood through tissue. Now place a major chunk of that blood flow through a narrow maritime choke point. That is what Hormuz is. A choke point is not just a route on a map. It is leverage in geographic form. If too much of the world's daily physical life moves through one narrow corridor, then instability in that corridor ceases to be a regional problem. It becomes a price problem everywhere. That is the first mechanism, the oil trigger. I do not need the strait to be fully, permanently, legally sealed for the pressure to begin. I only need risk to rise enough that shipping becomes more dangerous, insurance becomes more expensive, routing becomes more constrained, and buyers start acting as though future supply is less secure than it was yesterday. That alone can move the market. This is where most people make the first big mistake. They wait for physical shortage to become visible. The market reprices the probability of shortage first. That is why futures fall before factories close and prices rise before the public understands why. The market is not waiting for every barrel to disappear. It is repricing the world's confidence in movement. And once oil moves high enough, every central bank, every importer, every government finance minister, and every foreign reserve manager starts asking the same ugly question, where do we get the dollars? That question matters because oil is still overwhelmingly priced in dollars. So when the cost of energy rises during a geopolitical shock, countries that depend on imported energy do not merely need oil, they need the currency that purchases the oil. If they do not earn enough of that currency through trade in real time, they have to find it somewhere else. That is the second mechanism, the forced dollar hunt. Now let me tell you why this becomes America's problem faster than most Americans imagine, because foreigners already own a huge amount of American financial assets. This is one of the most important numbers in the entire story, and almost no one talks about it with the seriousness it deserves. The United States has been selling claims on itself to the world for years. Stocks, real estate, treasury bonds, all of it, foreign governments, foreign institutions, foreign central banks, and trade surplus countries accumulated dollar assets because America was deep, liquid, powerful, and for a long time still looked like the least ugly house in the neighborhood. That worked until it started working too well. The more of your assets foreigners own, the more your own financial conditions become vulnerable to their need for liquidity. That is a very uncomfortable sentence. But it is true. The net international investment position tells that story in plain, brutal language. America used to sit in a very different place relative to the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world owns an enormous stock of dollar claims. That means when global stress rises and the countries most exposed to an oil shock suddenly need a great deal of dollars fast, they do not have to invent the dollars. They can sell American assets. That is the third mechanism, the foreign liquidation channel. This is where an energy crisis becomes a bond. Market crisis. A country under pressure can sell treasury bonds. A reserve manager can reduce holdings. A central bank can meet domestic dollar demand by shrinking its external dollar asset book. And when enough of that happens together, the yield on U.S. government debt rises. Now, most people hear yields rise and think they are hearing a bond trader. S-side conversation. They are not. They are hearing the cost of the American state change in real time. Every 0.1% matters when you are carrying debt at this scale. That is what the public keeps underestimating. America is no longer debating the financing cost of a modest balance sheet. It is financing a mountain. When yields rise meaningfully, the interest burden begins compounding against the government much faster than politicians, voters, and commentators are emotionally prepared to admit. This is the fourth mechanism, the debt spiral. A debt spiral does not begin when a country literally cannot borrow tomorrow morning. It begins earlier when the mathematics of servicing the debt starts worsening faster than the politics can honestly absorb. Higher yields mean higher interest expense. Higher interest expense means bigger deficits. Bigger deficits mean more borrowing. More borrowing can push yields higher still, especially if confidence weakens or supply overwhelms demand. That is the loop. And loops are dangerous because once they become self-reinforcing, policy loses elegance. The choices become forms of pain instead of paths to stability. This is why Jerome Powell's occasional remarks about long-term fiscal unsustainability matter more than their dry tone suggests. When a central banker says the debt path ends badly, he is not telling you the date of disaster. He is telling you the direction of the road. And roads matter, because once you understand the road, you can see the logic of the next decision more clearly. The American state has three broad choices when a war-driven oil shock collides with heavy debt and rising yields. It can let yields rise, it can print, or it can retreat geopolitically and accept the strategic consequences. Let us take them one by one. If it lets yields rise, you get what I would call the market cleansing path. This sounds honorable to people who admire discipline from a distance. Let the bond market do its work. Let capital reprice risk. Let overextended borrowers feel the cost. Let the economy slow. Let recession cleanse the excess. Fine, that is coherent as rhetoric. It is much less pleasant in a live society carrying high debt, high asset valuations, and a political class trained to fear immediate pain more than long-term fragility. Higher yields crush weak housing, squeeze credit, compress equity valuations, and hit the government's financing cost at exactly the wrong time. Tax receipts weaken if asset prices fall and the economy slows. Banks lose on duration and credit. Households feel poorer, then spend less, then corporate earnings weaken further. The whole thing begins feeding on itself. In other words, the honorable path becomes politically unbearable. Now, the second choice, print. This is the path I believe the system is far more likely to choose when the pressure becomes acute enough. But the word print is too childish for what actually matters. So let us be precise. The state, through the central bank and the broader monetary apparatus, can step in to support the Treasury market, suppress yields, and flood enough liquidity into the system that the immediate debt financing crisis is postponed. That is the fifth mechanism. Monetary sedation. Here is the problem. Sedation works very differently depending on what kind of crisis you are treating. In 2008, the system was imploding through financial plumbing and mortgage collateral. The original large-scale asset purchases largely repaired bank balance sheets and financial transmission, painful, morally ugly in many ways, but not initially inflationary in the same consumer. Price way because the money largely stayed in the financial system first. In 2020, the story changed. Liquidity did not only repair the banking system, it bled into the broader economy more visibly. Deposits rose. Fiscal transfers hit households. Asset prices reflated hard. Then, with a lag, consumer price inflation followed. That distinction matters enormously, because now imagine printing into a live oil shock. Now you are not merely cushioning a financial seizure. You are adding liquidity to an economy that is already being hit by rising resource costs. That is a completely different animal. That is not just easing. That is gasoline on top of a fuel fire. This is why I say the war is the trigger and the debt is the motive. The trigger is external, the motive for printing is internal. And when those two things meet, you do not usually get a neat soft landing. You get stagflation. That is the sixth mechanism, the inflation trap. Stagflation is one of the nastiest macro environments because it attacks the mind from both sides. Growth weakens, but prices keep rising. Households feel poorer, but essentials still cost more. Investors want lower rates because the economy is soft, but lower rates can worsen currency weakness and inflation pressure. Governments want relief, but relief itself can become part of the problem. It is a trap because every apparent solution carries fresh poison inside it. Most people under 40 do not truly respect stagflation because they have no memory of how spiritually corrosive it can be. An ordinary recession is bad enough. An ordinary inflation surge is bad enough. Put them together and you create a social atmosphere in which trust begins to erode. Wages chase prices, prices outrun wages. Politicians lie more boldly. Financial commentators become more theatrical. Savers feel robbed. Borrowers feel trapped. The middle class feels squeezed from both directions at once. Now let us turn to the third path, retreat. This is the path most empire-minded nations hate more than recession or inflation because it is the path that challenges prestige. If America starts the confrontation, the world expects it to stabilize the choke point and restore the order that made dollar pricing credible. If it fails or leaves without demonstrating durable control, then something more dangerous than a recession begins: doubt. Doubt about American reach, doubt about security guarantees, doubt about whether the world must keep organizing energy trade around a monetary system backed by a power whose willingness or ability to enforce order now looks less certain than it did before. That is the seventh mechanism, imperial doubt. Empires rarely lose power in one cinematic collapse. They lose it in stages. First, the economics become heavier. Then the political costs of projection rise. Then an event reveals limits. Then the world begins revising its assumptions. The revision itself changes behavior. Alliances shift. Invoicing shifts. Reserve preferences shift. What once looked inevitable begins looking optional. That is what made the Suez comparison so powerful historically. Once a hegemon is seen failing to impose or restore order in a region central to trade and prestige, the symbolic damage can outlast the event itself. And here is the terrible part. All three paths let yields rise, print into the shock, or retreat strategically, carry inflationary and destabilizing consequences in their own way. Which means the argument is no longer about finding a clean solution. It is about choosing which form of ugliness can be managed best. That is not a comforting place for a reserve system to be. Now let us move from the crisis to the opportunity, because this is where the story stops looking merely macroeconomic and starts looking architectural. Every major crisis creates an opening for centralization, not because 12 men in a secret room always planned it in advance. I do not need childish conspiracy thinking to explain what power naturally does in a crisis. Power uses crises, that is enough. In 2008, the opportunity was greater central bank intervention and normalization of balance sheet expansion. In 2020, the opportunity was broader coordination, emergency authority, and a dramatic testing of how much social and economic behavior could be managed from the center. The next opportunity, in my judgment, is monetary distribution with behavioral control. That is the eighth mechanism. The wallet state, to understand why, you must first understand the two giant problems facing the people who run or influence the system. Problem one is debt, too much of it. Problem two is AI, too much labor disruption coming too fast. Now, if artificial intelligence and automation become productive enough, the official story will sound utopian: more efficiency, lower costs, more abundance, perhaps eventually some form of income support or universal basic income, because machines displaced enough human work that social stability must be preserved through transfers. Fine, that is the soft version of the pitch. But from the point of view of centralized power, income support creates its own problem. If people are paid through the state or through state-approved financial channels, then whoever controls the channel controls not only the money but the conditions of access, the timing, the programmability, and ultimately the boundaries of economic behavior. That is not just a welfare question, that is a control question, and at the same time, the debt must still be funded. So now ask yourself a harder question. What kind of system could both absorb enormous quantities of U.S. debt and deliver programmable financial rails to billions of people at once? That sort of wallet comes in a leather wallet, a digital wallet. Most people hear this and think immediately of central bank digital currencies in the most literal government app sense. That may happen in some places, but I suspect the more elegant and politically sellable version is not a single government branded wallet. It is a network of corporate branded wallets, payment apps, stablecoin platforms, and reward systems, all backed ultimately by Treasury collateral and all operating under a legal and regulatory framework that ensures they become a distribution network for government debt. That is the ninth mechanism, debt uploaded into the pocket. This is what stablecoin legislation and Treasury-backed digital money structures are pointing toward. A stablecoin issuer is required to hold supposedly safe reserve assets, and those reserves are overwhelmingly going to be treasuries or treasury-like instruments. That means every expansion of the wallet network becomes an expansion of demand for government debt. The debt does not disappear, it gets distributed, and because the wallet feels useful, convenient, modern, rewarding, and consumer-friendly, the user experiences the system not as debt absorption, but as upgraded finance. That is the genius of it. The debt problem is hidden inside convenience. Corporate wallets can offer yield, loyalty points, discounts, instant settlement, global access, and protection. For people in weak currency countries, they can market themselves as financial inclusion, dollar access, savings, modernization, and protection from local mismanagement. And all the while, the reserves backing the system can function as a giant global bid for U.S. government obligations. That is not theory in the abstract. A version of it already exists. Tether did not merely create a crypto token. It became, in effect, a significant buyer and holder of treasuries through a private digital currency wrapper. Now imagine that logic scaled through larger corporate channels with better branding, broader trust, and deeper integration into daily commerce. An airline wallet, an Apple wallet with yield, an Amazon wallet with rewards, a Tesla wallet tied to charging or car purchases, a McDonald's wallet if you like. The vulgarity of the image, the brand is less important than the pattern. Every brand becomes a debt distribution tube. Every user becomes, knowingly or not, a creditor. And because the wallet is digital, it carries a power paper cash never could. It can be programmed. That is the 10th mechanism, programmable money. This is the point where people either wake up or retreat in denial because the implications feel too large. A digital financial rail tied to regulated reserves can do everything the old system did and much more. Freeze, limit, classify, track, rote, reward, penalize, geofence, category, restrict, reverse, expire, slow, prioritize. The public hears convenience. I hear permissions. And permissions are political. You do not even need an evil genius for this. You only need institutions responding to incentives. Crime prevention, sanctions compliance, anti-terror financing, carbon limits, health emergencies, benefit eligibility, tax enforcement, national security protocols. Each one sounds partial, rational, and technical. Layer enough of them together, and the result is a money system that can be turned from neutral infrastructure into behavioral software. That is what makes it historically significant. You are no longer only deciding what money is worth. You are deciding who gets to use it, when, where, and under what conditions. That is an extraordinary concentration of power. Now let me say something about how this gets sold. It will not be sold as control. It will be sold as efficiency, as access, as inclusion, as modernization, as protection from inflation, as easier global payments, as a superior alternative to corrupt local banking systems, as yield on idle balances, as a financial safety net in an age of AI disruption. And some of those claims will contain truth, which is precisely what makes the system strong. The most durable control systems are never built on pure lies. They are built on genuine utility with asymmetrical power hidden inside the architecture. That is the genius of the modern financial state. It does not only command, it seduces. Now let us come back to the human level, because if all of this stays abstract, then it becomes just another clever macro theory and does not help you live. What does this mean for a person? It means you should begin distinguishing between assets you can truly control and claims that depend on someone else's network, legal permission, or digital goodwill. That is why self-custody matters. That is why physical assets matter. That is why local resilience matters. I am not romantic about any of this. Self-custody carries risks. Physical storage carries risks. Cash carries inflation risk. Gold can be confiscated or taxed or restricted under enough political pressure. Bitcoin can be volatile and technically mishandled. None of these are fairy tale escapes, but they do contain something precious that centralized systems increasingly dislike. Finality: if I hold an asset in my own possession or under a structure that is not continuously mediated by a programmable financial grid, then I have removed some portion of my life from the easiest layer of control. That matters. Not because it makes me invincible, because it preserves optionality. Gold has been valuable for thousands of years, not because it earns yield, but because it does not need a network to remain gold. It does not need an app update. It does not need a regulator's blessing in order to sit there being an asset. That is why every serious age of monetary stress rediscovers it. Not because gold is magic, because dependency becomes visible. The same principle is why cash still matters, even when inflation makes it imperfect. Cash is not a long-term wealth engine. It is a local sovereignty tool. It allows trade when the network is unavailable or uncooperative. It buys time. Time in a crisis is often more valuable than return. And local skill, local networks, and practical competence matter for the same reason. The more your life depends on one giant abstract grid, the more vulnerable you become when the grid changes rules. The more your life retains some physical, human, local capacity to function, the harder you are to push around. I call this the anti-grid posture. Not because you can leave the grid entirely, you probably cannot, but because you can reduce your total dependence on it. Now let me make the identity flip explicit. The average investor hears this story and asks, "So should I buy Bitcoin or gold?" That is too small a question. The steward asks, "Which of my assets can be frozen, inflated away, permissioned, or behaviorally steered, and which of them remain meaningfully mine under stress?" That is the real question. The average investor asks which trade wins. The steward asks which structure leaves him less governable. The average investor asks whether digital money is bullish for risk assets. The steward asks who benefits from a world in which every payment rail is also a surveillance rail. The average investor wants to predict the next move. The steward wants to survive the next redesign, that is, the grown-up frame, and once you adopt it, you stop being hypnotized by the surface debate over whether this war is temporary or whether yields will spike this week or next month or whether the dollar will crash tomorrow. Those questions matter in the short run, but they are not the deepest questions. The deepest question is this: what new financial architecture becomes politically and socially possible because the war, the debt, and the AI disruption created enough fear to sell it? That is what history trains you to ask. Not who shouted loudest on television, who used the crisis to upgrade the machinery. And if you are honest, the upgrade path is already visible. Debt pressure makes wider Treasury demand desirable. AI pressure makes digital income channels attractive. Stablecoin and wallet legislation makes private distribution politically easier. Corporate platforms provide the trusted interfaces. Geopolitical instability provides the justification. And the public, tired and scared enough, accepts a little more centralization in exchange for smoother function. That is how the system evolves, not through one giant announcement, through 1,000 helpful adjustments. So here is the final question I would leave you with. If the war is the trigger, the debt is the motive, and the wallet is the endpoint, where in your life are you still assuming that convenience and control are the same thing? Because they are not. The system that makes your financial life easier can also make it far easier to manage you. And the people who come through the next decade best will not necessarily be the ones who predicted every macro turn. They will be the ones who understood the direction of the redesign early enough to build some real assets, some local resilience, some self-custody, and some mental independence before the new rails became so normal that nobody remembered how optional they once were. That is what needed to be seen, and now you can see it.